Hello, and thank you for joining. This is Tim Joseph, Bradmark Technologies Technical Support. And today we have a live webcast. Ed Stangler, our R&D manager, is going to be presenting about the latest 5.1 release, surveillance for Neo4j and web reporting and time slicing. So let's get started. Ed, are you there?
Thank you, Tim. First, I'd like to remind everybody about an upcoming webinar. We have the last webinar in our series, in our 5.1 series, which will be about how to migrate to Surveillance 5.1. That will be coming up on December 3rd. And that's going to be a great webinar where we're going to talk about the kinds of things that you might encounter if you're upgrading from a 4 system, and also some interesting things in general, even if you're coming into a brand new installation of 5.1. But for today, we're going to be talking about Neo4j at the beginning of this webinar, and then we'll be talking on the last half, we'll be talking about the web reporting and time slicing improvements that we put into Bradmark Surveillance 5.1, as well as a little bit of 4.8 as well. And then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to briefly recap some of the essential items from Bradmark Surveillance for monitoring, especially if you haven't joined us in our previous webinar that we've had in this series. We have several major things that we do with Bradmark Surveillance. We do web monitoring, of course, for on-premises, cloud, and container databases. We have a lot of different metrics that we monitor to help keep the alerting going, to help keep the analysis going for database issues, as well as other types of issues as well. We have historical metrics, even if the database is offline. So if you want to do a post-mortem analysis of an issue that happened 3 o'clock yesterday or last week, we can do that with our recent history and our long-term history. We have reports for compliance. So if you have auditing requirements or you have other types of security requirements, we have things that help in those areas. And then, of course, we have a lot of unique metrics for more in-depth analysis depending on the database. Some of the most notable features in surveillance include time slicing, otherwise known as recent history. This is where you can go and find out what was the top SQL between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock yesterday, what was the top SQL by hour of the day, so you can see throughout the day what is the SQL that's taking up the most resources, those kinds of things. We also have flashback, where we can take the user interface, the same interface that we use for real time, we can take it back in time and see what was going on at 3 o'clock yesterday or 3 o'clock last week. And we also have web reporting, which is more for more long-term data, where you can see, for example, space usage over the last few months, those kinds of things. And then we have audit reports, as I mentioned before, where we can show SQL that's being run, bad logins, good logins, those kinds of things. We also have better security compliance in several areas than other products. We have encrypted TLS. We have a lot of other hardening items that are needed for things like PCI DSS. And we also have an alerts dashboard where we have the red, yellow, green status of alerts by server, by database, those kinds of things. So in 5.1, just to recap also from earlier in the webinar series, we have expanded into NoSQL monitoring. Of course, we've been doing monitoring for relational databases for many years, but now with 5.1, we are expanding into NoSQL areas. And of course, there are a lot of different NoSQL areas to go into. But for each of them, we're covering the critical areas. We want to know what's running, what the details that you need for those type of items. We've been trying to find out what's slow in the past on this particular NoSQL database, space usage, we're looking for hot objects, change settings, all of the critical areas that you'd expect in a monitoring product for a NoSQL database. And we have all of our critical features that we had for relational databases for many years now. We brought that over to NoSQL, things like our alerting, where you can send different types of alerts, things like SNMP traps, run external scripts, those kinds of things. You can, of course, see the red, yellow, green status as well. We have uptime reports. We have the recent history for the top SQL. We have the flashback, and we have the long-term reporting as well. For NoSQL, of course, there's, if you've ever installed NoSQL items or any type of open source software, you know there can be a lot of dependencies, there can be a lot of issues getting it going. We've done whatever we can to help ease that setup. So we want to make sure we get up and running right away on the product. We have lightweight dependencies whenever, only the minimal required. We include dependencies, libraries, those kinds of things as much as possible to help you get running up and running fast. We have deep dive metrics as much as we can for the NoSQL system. There's some metrics that are really, really difficult to get in some of these areas. We saw in a previous series, we saw MongoDB. MongoDB is a very different kind of animal versus relational databases in terms of getting metrics. We did a lot in that area, and then we'll see in Neo4j, we actually dig down deep in order to get some of the metrics as well. We correlate a lot of this stuff and summarize this metric data to give you more meaning on this stuff, because a lot of it is kind of difficult to sift through. We make sure we try to summarize it, try to make it simple. And of course, we have the drill down information necessary to help really try to diagnose these issues on this NoSQL database. There are a lot of different categories in NoSQL. It's kind of a overall overarching term. There's one type of NoSQL database that are document stores, like we saw with MongoDB. Graph databases are another type of area, and that's where Neo4j comes in. These are for doing things like when you're on an e-commerce site, for example, and you want to get a recommendation. Sometimes that's done with graph databases, and those kinds of things. And there's also key value stores like Redis and Memcache, and there are others as well. And I think as times go on, we'll be expanding into different areas as well, more areas of NoSQL for monitoring. Now, in Surveillance 5.1, as we've seen before, we introduced several new products. MongoDB is one area, Neo4j is another area. We've enhanced the set of web reports, and we'll see more of that a little later. And we've done 64-bit on Windows, as well as a lot of other enhancements, more minor enhancements that we've done to the product, just to make it easier to use, provide more stuff out of the box, and really make it a more complete experience for monitoring these type of databases. So, surveillance for Neo4j we'll talk a little bit about now. Again, it's a graph database, and that's a challenge in the fact that you have different kinds of queries than you might expect in other types of databases. Sometimes it's not straightforward in some things, and also, Neo4j, as a lot of NoSQL databases, is still relatively new. I mean, even though it's been around for quite a while now, it's still relatively new compared to like relational databases. So some of the tool sets, some of the commands, some of that's still evolving. Keeping up with that is a challenge, and also monitoring that can be a challenge. So we've really done a lot to try to make that simple and try to make that work right out of the box and give you the most maximum information as possible with little effort. Surveillance does support Enterprise Edition of Neo4j, as well as Developer Edition, which is most often known as the Desktop Edition. You could, for the best experience, really, of these two editions. I mean, there's some things you could probably get out of Community Edition, but for the best type of experience, the Enterprise Edition and the Developer Desktop Edition are the ones to get. Now, Neo4j doesn't run SQL; it doesn't run commands. It runs ciphers, and ciphers are basically, there's actually several different kinds of ciphers, but that's the overall name of it. And instead of like tables and relational databases, you have nodes and relationships. So it makes it ideal for doing these kinds of queries, on these kind of graph queries, to find out things like, what if I go to the grocery store and I buy one thing, then what else am I possibly going to buy on that same trip? Those kinds of questions. Now, if you're new to Neo4j, you might want to check out the gists or sample data sets that are available on the Neo4j website. Some great data is right there if you want to take a look at the kinds of queries, the kinds of data sets that Neo4j can support. It's a really great resource to take a look at. This is the kind of recent history view that we have for Neo4j. This is a top cipher by time range view, and we'll see more about this a little bit later, but it looks very familiar if you're familiar with our relational database, top SQL reports. This is the similar kinds of things. We'll see more about that a little later too. So in terms of monitoring Neo4j, we cover a lot of different areas. Of course, we have an overall health window. We have global statistics, including several different things, such as CPU percent, connection count, and a count of the number of transactions that are open, total store size, page cache usage percent, and page cache hit percent. And then actually, for different versions, we have additional statistics as well. Funny thing is, we actually have more statistics the older the version of Neo4j there is, for some reason. But we also have information on individual locks, and we have other things to correlate that to. We have information on connections. We have information on currently running ciphers, including the full cipher text, so you can see what's currently running out there. We also have information on transactions. So they have a similar system to like on relational systems where you have transactions. We also have I/O by database and space usage by database. Actually, it's even more than space usage. There's also different kinds of usages in the database that's shown in that window as well. We have system settings, and of course, we have error log information for Neo4j. In terms of recent history, we of course have our top cipher by time range and type cipher by hour of day, similar kinds of reports that we have for relational side. Now, one of the requirements we have is something called APOC. Prior to Neo4j 4.1, APOC was an extension library that was installed separately, so there's a bit of a requirement if we're going to get started, for example, on Neo4j 3.5 or something like that. This is just a very simple installation. But with 4.1, Neo4j made it much simpler, and they come prepackaged with the core version of APOC. So you still have a few steps you need to do in order to install it, but you don't have to go get it, for example, now. It comes prepackaged. There's actually a core version of APOC and a full version of APOC now. The full version has about 450 procedures or something like that, some crazy amount of procedures that just do everything in the whole wide world. But the core is a much smaller set. These are procedures that are written in Java, like Neo4j is, and delivered as jar files. Installation is very easy. You just copy a file, edit a comp file, and restart. You're good to go. Mainly, we use the SHA1 function in the APOC system, but we also, I think, we may have a few uses of MD5. None of this for security purposes, but just for getting hashes and those kinds of things in there. And there's some other utility functions that are useful in case you do have a Neo4j installation. There's some things like sleep and other types of functions that are useful in general scripting. So surveillance can monitor Neo4j 3.5 all the way to the latest 4.1. The executable follows our normal naming convention, and it's called DBG Neo4j. We connect to the database using the cbolt C driver, libcbolt. That's something that's produced separately. We actually build it and provide it in the distribution as an automatic support pack, so there's nothing additional you have to do in order to get that. We provide it out of the box, and it's very, very easy to connect into the Neo4j system, but the driver does require Red Hat 7 or CentOS 7, or in the case of Windows, Windows 7. Everything seems to be 7. But newer versions of Red Hat, for example, are required for this because they do try to be a little bit more cutting edge than some of the other types of databases. And then the connect string is very simple. It's just a host name, :port/db, that kind of thing. Very familiar with how we do it with other products. We do require admin role at the moment in order to be able to monitor. And also, we do have the ability to terminate ciphers. So if there's a currently running cipher out there that's taking too much resources, taking too long, you can kill that directly from the UI, from the web client. But that may require additional privileges depending on things as well. So surveillance does show the native commands and views like currently executing ciphers. They're in cipher format, and this is an example of a kind of query. You can see here we have a query involving people and films and directors. We actually, for a lot of this you'll see is kind of James Bond oriented. So there's people and films and villains and cars and that kind of stuff like that. And so there's anyway, this query does a match, and then it returns straight to columns. It does an order by. So this is the kind of query you would see for a particular query. But there's also another whole set of commands for more admin type of things. So in the bottom query, we can see we're calling a function called listconfig. We're yielding or basically selecting some columns, and then you can also add a where clause and order by and those kinds of things as well. And this is typical of the kinds of commands that you would see in Neo4j. We also recommend having two system options for the best monitoring, the track query CPU time and the track query allocation. Set those to true, and you get much better results for monitoring the ciphers. You get much better metrics and stuff like that. And then you can verify that with the following cipher as well. And you can see here is another typical kind of admin query. We're calling a function yielding, doing a where clause, and returning all of the columns. Okay, so I'll briefly go into some of what we do for Neo4j in a demo. So here we are in our web client, and I'm going to go ahead and connect in. And we have our familiar tree on the left side where we can see the different agents, the alerter agent, the analyzer agent, the Neo4j agent. And we can come in here, and we can see the different kinds of windows we have available. Of course, we have a global window, where we can see different kinds of information like CPU statistics. So here's CPU over the last 8 hours. It's a pretty idle system going on, and I think probably my test script's probably already stopped. But we'll see here. We also have transaction count, total store size. It's been pretty well. It's been going up a little bit late in the last few minutes. Hopefully, I don't run out of space. Cache percent, cache usage, those kinds of things are available here. And then, as I said, we also have other statistics, especially in older versions. We actually have a bit more here as well. We also have information on connections. So here again, we have the items that are running. We can see the full ciphertext at the bottom here. I'll go ahead and see if I can start up another set of activity here. And hopefully that'll come up in just a moment here. Let me go ahead and refresh this. Just take a moment to come in. Here we go. So here we have another demo script coming in. But you can see the application that's listed here, the login, the client IP address, the client port, and the full SQL text when there is some SQL going on. So here we have a query. We have a match query and then a delete going on for this particular one. We also have information on locks. Not currently any locks at the moment, but you can just see the resource type, resource ID, query ID, those kinds of things. And of course, we have currently running SQL out there as well, or excuse me, ciphers, the full cipher text as well. Now, if we scroll over to the right, in addition to the preview, we have the number of locks being taken out, the CPU time, the wait time, page hits, those kinds of things as well. Now, if I wanted to, I can also go back in time. We can use our flashback feature to go back in time. I can go up here to the upper left and hit flashback, and I can go back to a time this morning that I had some issues going on. And I think actually I have to go a little bit further. And here we go. So at this particular time, 7:19 in the morning, I actually had a big set of contention going on. I had several scripts running, and they were there's contention on deletes going on. I can see all of them out there running. I can see over to the right side the page hits going on. I was doing quite a bit of I/O at the time, CPU time, and all that great stuff as well. So I can see all that kind of stuff. I could open up different windows if I wanted to see locks, if I wanted to see connections. I can see all that as well. And then I can go back and forth. I can flash forward a minute, flash forward 10 minutes, 10 seconds, those kinds of things. And then I can flash right back to the present as well. From here, if there was something long running, I could also kill it over here. I could hit the kill query command, enter the credentials on the left side, and then I'd be able to kill the query as well. So some of the other windows we have available include transactions. So this is separate from the queries that are running. This is the transactions that are open out there, similar kinds of information. We have information on allocated bytes, page hits, elapsed time, those kinds of things. We also have information on database I/O. So this is a summary by databases. We have 3 databases, including a sales database, which is where a lot of stuff is going on, not at the moment, but earlier. In fact, let's go, what we can see here, the information on log appends, log rotations. If we scroll over to the right here, we have information on committed transactions. So a lot of transaction-oriented information, checkpoints, those kinds of things are available per database. We can also look at databases in terms of space usage. So here we have total space. This is kind of a small database. But you can see we have a half a gigabyte sales database, and again we have information on just a lot of different counts in terms of node count, property counts. As we saw with the query when it was matching and doing things like that, those are nodes, and you have properties and relationships between the nodes, so you have counts of all of that on here as well. And then we have system settings where you can search different types of settings. So for example, APOC related settings, you can see that on here. Easily searching, you can export this as well. So now in addition to this, we also have information on recent history. So we can go in here and take a look at, for example, the top ciphers in the last 3 hours. I'll go ahead and say for the last 3 hours, go. And here we have CPU graph at the top. You can see I had a little bit of a CPU spike. I just had a CPU spike a little while ago, and then about 20 minutes ago I had another CPU spike. So the last couple hours worth. And then up here I have the actual top SQL, top ciphers that have been running. And you can see here I have a really just a crappy unwind that I've been doing that causes a lot of, it's like a big loop basically. And here I can see the DB time broken down by idle percent, wait percent, CPU percent, and see what's, so in this case, it's mostly CPU usage, but if it could be waiting on stuff, it could be idle, it could be in the application if it's idle, for example. Those kinds of things you can determine from here. And you can then save off and search this as well. So in addition to looking at the individual items by time range, we can also take a look at it by hour of day. I'll go ahead and open up another tab here and take a look at it by hour of day. I'll go ahead and say from a few hours ago until now. And we'll go ahead and run this and see. Now I don't have a lot of data at the moment on this system, but I can click on here and see this orange one has been running here, and you can see it's been running a little bit over here. There's a different query that's been running over here in green. The green is the unwind statement that we saw earlier. The orange one is our match statement with the delete going on. So you can see if a particular statement is causing a problem throughout the day. You can see this, of course, by elapsed time. You can also see it by CPU time, and you can see here the unwind was much more CPU intensive than the match statement in this case. You can also take a look at the wait time. Now here we got back to the match statement being I/O intensive, and then the idle time as well, which also was a lot of idle time there. So a lot of different metrics to take a look at the ciphers as well. So that's a little bit of our Neo4j module. In addition, we have alerting, we have this long-term storage of metrics and all the kinds of normal things you'd expect from the product, including the alerting. So if we go over to the alerting side here, we can take a look at the alerting by the red, green, yellow kind of status. Right now everything's green, so we don't have a whole lot going on. It's not really interesting. But you can see here we had some problems earlier, and now everything is A-OK. So now we'll go back to the slides. Just to quickly mention a few other miscellaneous items that are going on in our 5.1 product, especially if you haven't joined us in the prior webinar series. We have 64-bit Windows now for the product. So if you are on Windows, there's some changes going on 64-bit. We move the files around, and there's other things regarding the client, but nothing that's too difficult to get a hold of, and it really makes it a little bit more standardized in terms of the location of the product. And we also have just a quick note about HTML5. We actually do have an HTML5 client coming out very soon. It'll be actually in our 5.2 product, but we will make it available for earlier versions of surveillance. So if you're on 4.7.3 or later, we'll have an easy patch that'll be available. You just need to install it on the central alert server or the CAS if you have that, or whatever system you have the product on. And so you'll have that available very shortly. Some things, of course, any enhancements that we made in 4.8 or later won't be available with this patch, but for any functionality you do currently use, we'll have the HTML5 version available for that. And also in the current product, as it is right now, we have TLS 1.3 supported. So that's the latest and greatest in terms of TLS. So if you have those kind of security requirements, that's already in the product that is available in the 4.7 and later. Of course, you can try some of this yourself. If you haven't used the product before, we have a demo set up at this website. There's some activity on there generated every day. If you want to take a look at it through flashback or through real time, this is our 4.7 product, and this will be updated shortly with our 5.1 series. But you can take a look at it for yourself and try it out. And this is what it looks like. If this is the kind of real-time kind of view you would have for SAP ASE, for example, the flashback. So now we'll open it up for any Q&A.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. We appreciate it. I just was noting the time. We're coming up on 45 here, so time for any questions that we might see out there. Did you give any kind of time frame on the HTML5 or any of the other versions of surveillance that you'd be releasing?
Yeah, the 4.8 version should be out very shortly, and the 5.1 will be actually out pretty shortly as well. We've had a few delays due to the COVID situation, but we do plan on having those out very shortly. And then the HTML5 version will be out in the next few weeks. Obviously there's the hard deadline of the Flash capability going away for many people. So we'll be having it out in time for that. And again, it'll be a very simple installation, basically just an unzipping of a zip file to get that going and running. And you can run that in parallel to the old version if you still need the old version, for example. But of course, preferably we'd like to keep the new version going. So that'll be available for, as I said, versions 4.7 and later.
And with the recently executed sequel, you mentioned a new method that allows finer granularity for sequel that lasts a very short time. Can you maybe just explain a little bit of how that's improved the granularity of surveillances capturing the sequel?
Yeah, I mean, basically, some of the enhancements we've done, especially on ASC, for example, you're able to really capture things that are running very quickly. Like, because before, we used the sample method, and you can still use that method. There's no problem for it. But if you have, a very short SQL that's running in, much less than a second, for example. If it's running continuously throughout the day, then of course by random chance we're going to see some of that during our sample method, because by default we sample 10 seconds, for example. We're going to see that on a continuous basis, and we'll be able to get a good sampling of that. That's why it's the sample method. But in some cases, you have an uneven distribution of those kind of query times, or you need to find stuff that's maybe a little bit harder to find. In those cases, it's really great to be able to find every single SQL statement, and that's basically what we're doing. We're capturing it in a way that's very efficient, to be able to see really every statement. Just as we're doing already on some other databases prior, we're able to do that now for ASC and for some other databases as well. It's really exciting, and with that, we also can find out the exact execution counts, and from that we can generate analytical columns and really just improve a lot of things in the recent history reports, as well as the new web reports as well.
That's great. Well, thanks, Ed. And do we see any more questions out there? We appreciate your sharing the new features and all of the information about surveillance products. Feel free to reach out by email or your thoughts and session about the session today. Anything on your Ed that you wanted to add, Ed?
No, just thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. We hope that you'll join us for our next and final session in the webinar series about how to migrate to 5.1. That'll be on December 3rd, and in that one we're going to show a 5.1 installation. We'll be talking about some of the issues going from 4.x to that version, pretty much from 4.7 or later going to 5.1. Talking about some of the issues and some of the new tools that we have available, because I think we've also added some really nice tools and things to make the whole experience easier for using the product. We may have additional things to show at that time as well. So I think it'll be a great webinar.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we look forward to that upcoming webinar, and we appreciate everyone's attendance today and wish you a safe day and see you again.